Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm hopefully going to teach you something about the Ponziani opening and maybe convince you to add it to your opening repertoire. Now while this opening is not as common as something like the Spanish or the Italian openings, it's a great one and it's full of so many tricks, traps, and exciting lines. So I hope you guys enjoy this one and let's get straight into it. This opening comes about after e4, e5, knight f3, and knight c6, and white here plays c3. And the idea is quite obvious. We're playing for the d4 push and to take control of the center. And let's look at black's most common responses. And a move I want to show first is very surprising because it is extremely common given the fact that it just loses on the spot. In the Lichess database, this is the second most played move up until the master level, so this is the move bishop c5. And here, the response is again quite obvious for white. We want to push here on d4, immediately attacking the bishop and taking control of the center. Now after takes, and bishop b4 check, which is black's most common response, we just block with the knight and we've developed our pieces nicely, and we've got two pawns in the center and are ready to push at any point. Now, after black tries to develop here with knight g to e7, preparing to castle on the king side, we can strike immediately in the middle with d5. And you'll notice this knight can't come forward here, so it has to go to a5 or b8 if it wants to move somewhere. Now, moving to a5 is a big blunder because we have the move queen d4, attacking the bishop and the pawn over here. If they take, hoping you'll take with the pawn and lose this fork, you can just take back on c3 with the queen instead. And now you're attacking the knight and the pawn and you're still forking these two pieces. So the best move here for black is to actually just give up the knight, castle, let you take, and you're just up a clean piece here as white. But what your opponent might try and do is defend the knight here with b6. And here you're just going to take on g7 and try and bring this knight into g5, attack that f7 square, and you will be very comfortable here. So if instead of going to a5, your opponent goes back to b8, you play the same move, queen d4, and while it's a little less effective, you're again forking the pieces, forcing black to take here on c3, otherwise they're going to lose g7, and then after castles, you're just going to develop normally, bring the bishop out to c4, bring this other bishop out and castle, and you're very happy here with control over the center and all your pieces out. Now, if instead of playing bishop b4 check, your opponent decides to retreat to b6, you can just develop again in a normal manner, playing knight c3, and your opponent will play something like d6 just to try and get their bishop out. And here you have a sneaky move with bishop b5. And if they play something like knight e7 here, you have the move d5, and you're just winning a piece here because of the pin. They can play a6, attacking your bishop, but you just play bishop a4, and you're still pinning this knight to the king, and you'll be winning a piece. So instead of that, they'll probably play bishop d7, breaking the pin, and you can just castle and bring your bishop to e3, play h3, and you have a nice setup here. So that's the overview for bishop c5. Let's look at what might happen if your opponent knows a little bit of theory here. Now this is the most common move that we're about to look at the moment. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, c3, the most common move for black is to play knight f6 here. And the idea is just to attack this e4 pawn and try and take control of the center this way. And what we're going to do here is play d4. Now this looks a little bit crazy because it does just give up this e4 pawn, but don't worry, it's not a gambit. We're going to be taking a pawn back very, very soon. So black has two options here, either to take on e4 or to take on d4. And either way they take, we're going to push the pawn on the opposite rank forward. And this will make more sense as we go through it. So if they take on d4 here, we're going to play e5. And while you might be a little scared of this knight coming forward to g4, double attacking this pawn, it's nothing to worry about because after knight g4, we just take back on d4 and now we're threatening h3. And after d6 here, h3, the knight can only go back to h6 and we're going to double the pawns here and we have a nice comfortable position and black really can't castle kingside after this. So instead, your opponent should go to d5 with the knight. And after they go to d5, we'll just grab back with the pawn and they might give a check with the bishop and we can just block and castles and we can just trade off, bring our queen out to b3, and here we have takes, and castles, and this is just a nice, easy, playable position for white. So this is nothing really to worry about. Now there's one more move they might make here. After you attack them here with the e5 pawn, they might jump forward here to e4. And this is slightly inaccurate, but it's still definitely playable for black. So here we play queen e2, and they can either play d5 or f5, pushing one of these pawns to try and defend. Now, if d5, we're just going to grab back en passant, and they can't take back like this because they are pinned. And then they'll play f5 to reinforce their knight, and we're just going to trade on d4 and play f3 here. The knight is pinned to the king, and they're going to be losing this knight at some point. Now, this is a line that's a little bit tricky, so it's nice to remember this one. They can then go queen h4, which looks a little bit scary, but we can just play g3, and after they take and take our rook, we play knight c3, they castle, and we grab the knight over here, and after bishop f4, bishop h3, we castle queenside here. And we've got 2 pieces for the rook. And usually 2 pieces is favorable over the rook. So even if they're trading here on f1, we have absolutely nothing to worry about here with the white pieces. And we're going to be winning this pawn back on e4. So in this position, as I mentioned, there's the 2 options, either taking on d4 or e4. So let's look at what happens if your opponent decides to take on e4 here. Now here, as I said, we're pushing the pawn on the opposite side. So here we are pushing this d5 pawn, and we're forcing the knight to move somewhere. Now after we push d5, the knight can either go to e7 or b8. But most of the time your opponent will take this knight over to e7, because here it has the chance to reroute to f5 or g6. After knight e7 here, we are just going to grab this pawn here on e5. And now after we take here, there is a move that is played quite a bit by black here that really should not be played. Here, you want to get rid of this knight in the center. This knight is very strong over here, and you want to get rid of it. And you also want to start developing your pieces as well when you're playing as black here. So d6 looks like a very logical move, but it just loses, because here we have the amazing move bishop b5 check. And let's just look at what can happen after bishop b5 check. So after c6, we're going to take the pawn. And if they try and grab your knight here on e5, we have c takes b7, revealed check. And if they try and block with the bishop here, we can just take on d7 with the queen. They take back, and we promote to a queen here. And then they have to block with the knight to give themselves a square to move. We capture, they can't take back because they're pinned, and then the king is going to come to e7, and we take over here. And up 18 points of material here. I trust you guys to win this one with the white pieces. So this is how it can possibly turn out. So now you know that you can't take this knight here on e5. So what might happen is they grab back here on c6. And then you're just going to take here with the knight, and if they take back, you have a nice fork here. After bishop d7, you're just going to grab this knight. Over in the center, up 4 points of material, very happy there. But there is one move that doesn't immediately lose a lot of material here for black, and this is the move queen b6. And here you are just going to play knight d4 with a check on the king, and after they block, you get that king out into the center. And here is white, you can just get castled, and then what you're going to do is attack this weak king in the center, attack the other pieces. So for example, knight a3 to c4 is a really nice maneuver to remember, just trying to attack in the middle of the board, and you should be completely winning here as white. Your opponent should not be playing d6 in this position here. This just should not be happening. Instead, what your opponent should be playing is knight g6, and here this is also completely fine. You're just going to trade off and play something like bishop d3 and castle. And here you have no problems. You can play c4 and have some nice pawns in the middle of the board and take advantage of the fact that the king is going to be stuck in the center for at least a couple more moves, and they have some double pawns over here. Let's have a look at the last line that I think will give you guys maybe a bit of trouble. Now, this line here arises from the same opening with knight takes e4. And after this, instead of moving their knight here, they can play the move bishop c5. And this is a really great move, and it can become very sharp. So what you're going to do here is take the knight on c6 and try and get out of the attack that black is about to send your way with some extra material at the end. They cannot take on f2 with the knight. While this looks like a fork, this would be a big mistake to take like this, because we have the move queen d5, and after they take on h1, we're just going to take with check first and then take this bishop on c5. And the problem is this knight over here is going to be trapped. It can't escape out of this jail on h1. And once we take back, we're going to have 3 pieces for the rook and a couple of pawns and be much better out of that. So they can't take with the knight on f2. Instead, they must take with the bishop here. And here you have one move with the king, so it's not hard to remember. You play king e2. And there is one tricky line that you should know about, which is b takes c6. And basically the idea is they want to bring their bishop out to a6 and try and checkmate you or make you lose your queen. For example, if you play something like bishop e3, trying to trade off queens, then bishop a6 is a nightmare because the king has no squares to go and you have to block with the queen here. So be mindful of that. After b takes c6, you should play queen a4. And this defends the a6 square, and it also attacks the knight on e4 as well. So after this move, there is nothing to worry about. b takes c6 is a little dubious, but it goes for a trap. Instead, your opponent might play the best move, which is bishop b6 here. And here you have to remember the move queen d5. You're going to attack this knight and also threaten to take on b7 with a fork on the bishop and the rook. And here your opponent is going to play knight f2, attacking your rook on h1. You take here, they are going to sacrifice the bishop, and you take the bishop on b7, and they will take your rook. And from here, as white, you will have 2 pieces for the rook. So this is going to be an imbalanced game to play, but there shouldn't be too many issues here as white. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is the Ponziani counter gambit, which is f5 here. After c3, your opponent plays f5. And this is a fun idea, but we're just going to grab this pawn on f5 here, take the pawn, and let our opponent try and work their way back here. Now, queen f6 is the best move here for black, but white still has a slight advantage here. You just play d4, strike in the center, and after a move like e4 attacking your knight, you're just going to head back to d2. The queen is going to take on f5, and now you have a nice move with f3, basically just trying to get your pieces out this way. They'll defend with d5, and you play bishop e2. After bishop d6, you'll capture in the middle and then put a nice knight on the c4 square. They'll play knight f6, and queen b3 here is also played. This is going to stop them from castling just for now because you have some threats of revealed attacks down this diagonal. Now, some other things that they can play in this opening here is after you capture on f5, they can push with e4 straight away. Here you're going to move the knight to d4, and after knight f6, you'll play d3, just trying to undermine this pawn here in the center. Then they'll capture on d4, you capture back, and d5 is played. You can trade pawns in the center, and after bishop takes on f5, white is just slightly better in this position, and you can develop your pieces, for example, like bishop c4, and you can just take advantage of the fact that this diagonal over here is really weak, and they're going to struggle to get castled over to the king side. They might try and castle queen side, but then you can start marching your pawns up on this side of the board after castling king side. Another move they can play is d5 here. And here you're just going to play bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king, and bishop d6 played, and you can play d4, and then jump your knight into the middle of the board, and exploiting this pin in the middle. After takes and takes on c6, we'll play queen h5 here, and force the king over to f8, and then grab this bishop here on e5. And again, this is very nice and comfortable to play with the white pieces. Now let's look finally at something your opponent might play if they've studied a lot of engine lines. And this is a very tricky opening to be playing with black. So it's not played that much at the high levels just because a lot of the moves are counterintuitive. So after c3 here, the best move for black according to the engine is d5. And here we're going to play actively with the move queen a4. And the idea is that this knight here is going to be pinned. We're putting pressure on this e5 pawn here, and we're also keeping an eye on e4 as well. Now, if they try and grab this pawn here on e4, we're just going to take here, exploiting the pin. If they try and break the pin with the bishop here, we will grab the bishop, queen takes back, and then we get to grab a pawn on e4. We just develop normally, strike with d4 in the center, get our pieces out and castle here. And this is very comfortable. So In this position as well, queen d5 is possible, and we're just going to grab the knight here on c6. And they can't take back with the queen here because of bishop b5 winning the queen, so they must take back with the pawn, and we're going to play bishop c4. And after queen d7, we just castle. And again, white is better here just because we've got more pieces out, and also these c-pawns are going to be a big liability for black in the future. Instead of taking on e4 here, your opponent can also play a move knight f6, which looks like it defends the center nicely and puts some more pressure on the e4 pawn. Here, again, we can just take on e5. And after takes on e4, we can play this nice move bishop c4 with a lot of pressure on the e7 square. And the best way really to defend this with black is to play bishop e6, and then we're just going to take on c6. They can't take on c4 as an in-between move because we're threatening to take the queen with a revealed check, so they have to take back, and then we'll just take on e6. And look at these pawns, they do not look very nice, and we can just grab this pawn over here on c6 and make this king move to f7. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you're not super booked up in this opening. And that's why a lot of people are not really playing it that much. Now, the best move actually after queen a4 is to play the move f6. And that is just to defend this e5 pawn. All the pressure is on the e5 pawn, so you've got to find a way to defend it. Here, we're just going to play a nice simple move, d3, after this is played. And in this opening, we're going to play for the b4 and b5 pushes, expanding on the queen side and develop normally. And white should have no issues again. And this is perfectly fine. Now, this is basically a worst case scenario because this is engine moves by black, but it's still nothing to worry about because it's not a very aggressive way to play. They'll bring their knight out to e7, a bishop to e6, and you can just bring your pieces out and castle on the king side, and you shouldn't be too afraid of this. And one more thing that they can do here as well is they can play bishop d7 here. And this breaks the pin and it stops you from being able to take here because obviously knight can now just grab back because they are unpinned. And here what we're going to do is just take on d5. Now the knight has to move, and they do have a nice move here with knight d4, but there's nothing to worry about because we just go back to d1. They're forced to take on f3 because we got pressure on e5 and the knight is hanging here. So after they take, we take back with the queen. And after knight f6, we're going to just develop the bishop. They push forward, the queen can come back. And here we're just up a pawn. We might be lagging a little bit behind in development, but we can just play d4, which opens up our bishop and the knight. And they can't take back with en passant because the pawn is pinned to the king. So we're just going to get our pieces out and castle, and we'll just be up a pawn out of the opening. And there we go. This is a basic overview to the Ponziani opening. Now, obviously, I didn't cover all the lines in this opening. There's a lot more to it. But if you want to see more and where I got a lot of the opening ideas from, I'm going to link a Chessable course for you guys in the comments. It's completely free and you can check it out there. It explains a lot of these ideas in more detail. I just wanted to produce something that was easy to watch and easy to understand. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much.